Well, good afternoon from Ithaca, New York, home of Cornell University. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Nicholas Phillips, and I'll be serving as your host and moderator. Now, many of us yearn for that perfect yard or for that beautiful landscape. There's just kind of something about it. Beautiful landscaping can really, really stand out. I'm definitely one of those who goes into Lowe's and tries to pick out that perfect plant that looks its best. But what you're about to hear is that it's not just about the plant itself, it's about the soil. And we have the perfect guest to talk about how we can improve our landscaping and how what plants look like and kind of what to look for as far as their beauty, but also what will flourish as well. So joining me is Professor Nina Bassuk and landscape architect Zac Rood. They are the faculty authors of our certificate program, Sustainable Landscape Design for Woody Plants. And both of you, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you, Nick.
Awesome. So, audience, we really want to kind of help. Really want you to kind of help us tailor our conversation here. So, we'll be asking you just a couple poll questions to kind of get your thoughts on some things as well. So, to our first question, we want to know, what is your favorite landscape plant? What's that thing where, if you're driving by somebody's house or something, what kind of plant really, really stands out for you? And with that, I really want to kind of start off with you, Nina. So, similar question, before we kind of dive into the huge conversation, what's your favorite landscape flower, favorite landscape plant?
Well, there's so many. I mean, it's hard to pick one, but I've had a long history with oak trees, and so doing research on them, continue to do work on them. So seeing a magnificent oak tree is really a heartthrob kind of for me, and they last for, in some cases, hundreds and hundreds of years if you do it right. And so I guess oaks would be one of the big factors for me. What do you think, Zac?
Yeah, I mean, I've mulled that over a little bit too because we were talking about it earlier, and I heard you laugh a little bit because we were joking like, how do you pick your favorite kid? But the oaks do stand out as a landscape plant. I have a lot more thoughts on that, but one of the things that you said was about their ability to withstand, to age.
Gracefully.
And stand for a long time. They can become. I've seen some. They become landmarks.
Right.
Even here on the Cornell campus, I think there's a particular oak that's, it's as recognizable as McGraw Tower.
Yeah.
It's really they become, because they can stand so long.
Yeah.
They become part of the landscape as landmarks.
And I love the willows at Stewart Park. Those have to be my favorite. I know I can't put them in my yard because they're to take over my whole house, but those I absolutely love those. And I mentioned a little bit in my opening salvo, Nina, that it really, the soil and understanding the soil is really, really important. So with that, how should a lay person who maybe just moved into the house or are kind of trying to understand their landscape, how should a layperson think about their soil?
Well, I mean, soil is critical, but you think about there are 6 major things or basic things that plants need: air, CO2, water, nutrients, and temperatures, appropriate temperatures. So if there are those six basic things, soils actually determine the amount of those, of 4 of those things. So nutrients, water, air, and appropriate temperatures. The bigger the soil, the temperature moderates slowly. So soil is critical for basic plant growth of anything, from a house plant to a plant in the landscape. So I think that it's, other thing than soil is just not soil alone, but the health of the soil is critical. So drainage, volume, water holding capacity, all those things are critical.
And what are some of the different, properties that make up soil?
Well, soil is not a solid. Okay, so soil is there's about 50% solid and a little bit of organic matter, and then there's air and there's water. So the properties have to be, you can't have 100% solid or else you have a rock. So you have to have a soil that plants can actually grow through and get the water and nutrients that they need.
And is there a general composition of soil, or what's kind of the general composition of soil?
Well, again, you have the solid part, the rock, derived from rocks, sand, silt, and clay, and then you have organic matter, which is derived from living things. then water and air, ability for plants to have air, because roots actually respire and they take in oxygen as do people. So that's critical. And then the nutrient availability is also, you need plants get their nutrients from the soil primarily, and their macro elements that they need a lot of, and their micro elements they need a lot of. They need less of, but they're still essential.
And are there certain chemical compositions when it comes to soil?
Well, that's what I'm saying. The nutrients are chemical composition. So there's nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, sulfur. They're the macro guys. And then you have micro, which you need in small amounts, but are still essential. Are
the other 13.
The other 13. Iron, manganese, boron, nickels. I mean, there's a huge number of micro. But in some cases, we found that nickel, which you don't need a lot of, is essential for some birches and hickories. So if we didn't have that in the soil, they wouldn't do very well.
And are there different soil compositions in different parts of the country? So if I were to take, soil from up here in the Northeast, would that be different from, say, the South, North Carolina, or out west? What are some soil compositions as far as different parts of the country go?
Well, soil is derived from the basic bedrock, and so there's all these different bedrocks that we live on, and granitic and limestone and sedimentary rocks, and all those, the bedrock determines a lot of the composition of soil.
Okay. And without getting kind of too much into the weeds, are soils in different parts of the country similar to other parts of the world? So
yes. I mean, there's, if you go to the White Cliffs of Dover, you're on a limestone soil. The White Cliffs are limestone. And up in upstate New York, you have limestone areas too. So you can have some of the same bedrock that you would have in other parts of the world.
So we're slowly kind of starting to get some audience responses into our first question. What was your favorite landscape plant? And we're kind of getting a little all over the board. We get about 4 responses in now. So we have golden chain tree, hydrangeas, actually evergreen. Hydrangeas are actually one of my favorites. I feel like they're always tough to grow for whatever reason, though.
You have to choose the right one.
Yeah, my wife loves hydrangeas and she's an expert at it, but for whatever reason, I can't get my hydrangeas to grow. I don't know what it is.
Talking about your hydrangea collection.
Yeah, so at Cornell we have the largest panicle hydrangea collection in North America.
Oh, wow.
But the reason why you might not get your hydrangeas to grow is they might be the macrophylla hydrangea, which blooms on old wood. So the buds that you created in the fall have to carry over to the spring, and our winter temperatures are too cold, those buds might die.
They can die right to the ground.
Right.
Yeah.
And the plant will come back, but you won't have any flowers. So that could be an issue. So there are plants that bloom on new wood, which is the current year's growth, and those that bloom on old wood, which is the buds created in the fall. Okay. And those can get killed by our winters.
Okay. Any recommendations to kind of help me before we go?
Panicle hydrangeas are great. They're just wonderful, easy to grow.
And a lot of work's been done on varieties in the past decade.
Yeah, hundreds of different varieties, pinks and whites, and they last from
small to big.
They last from August through to October.
Yeah, I think the hydrangeas we have are white actually, so they're beautiful. They're just fussy. That's all.
Yeah, they're easy.
Very, very true. And how should we think about the different plants and picking different plants when we think about what might be native to a specific region, maybe of the world or just of the country?
Well, this is a really hot topic right now in horticulture in general. People think we should only plant native plants, in which case I think the most important thing is to have a plant well adapted to the site. You could have a plant that might be native to a certain area, but it's not adapted to the site conditions, in which case it's not going to grow. There are lots of plants that are non-native that do very well in terms of the ecosystem services they provide, in terms of pollinator support and all that good stuff. But I think, there are some native plants in an ecoregion, an area that has the same climate, soil, and geography that might be important because certain birds or pollinators rely on them. But in general, a large group of flowering plants will provide those services.
And, before we were even, thinking about doing this keynote and everything, you guys had mentioned, a really, really big, important thing, and I mentioned it again in my opening salvo, was, understanding the soil and everything like that. So with that as kind of our foundation, what's the first thing you would recommend that someone do to evaluate their soil and understand their soil?
Well, we call it a site assessment before you start planting plants in the ground. You need to understand where you are, the big picture, what your winter temperatures, what your rainfall like, and then the micro site conditions in terms of your soil health, the soil volume, the pH, the alkalinity or acidity of the soil is critical, and then sunlight, shade. There's a site assessment that we do that's critical to saying, okay, what should do well on this site.
And audience, we want to loop you again just very, very quickly. Thank you all for your responses. So on to our second poll question. Again, you can scan the QR code with your phone and we'll kind of see some of your responses here on our screen here. So we want to know, what was something that you wanted to plant this year that you weren't able to get to? And again, as we kind of wait for your responses, Zach, I want to kind of loop you in here. So Zach, favorite landscape plant, favorite tree, what's up?
And I think I touched on this a bit with Nina, and we kind of came to a consensus around oaks, but there was something else buried in that response, and that's that, when you see a plant, really an outstanding or stunning plant that has it feels like it's the right plant in the right place and it's really thriving, that's what really gets me excited, is that making that match between the plant, its environment, and the cultivation of it. So it's really this kind of like this three-part formula where there's the people and the plants and the environment kind of getting together. And when you just see a plant or a planting that's thriving and healthy, I think that's what really gets me excited. Yeah.
And I know we're kind of slowly starting to get some responses. We got about 10, so a little all over the map here. Seeing a lot of fruits and vegetables, actually. So we have fruit trees, onions, tomatoes,
I told you.
Perennial snapdragons. Do you like planting fruits or food bearing?
Yeah, absolutely. I have an orchard.
Right.
So in the woody plants realm, we put in an orchard a couple of years ago. Part of the landscape here in the Finger Lakes, the movement to cider apples, and there's a lot of work that's been done here on apple trees, and so I was lucky to have access to that work. There's a local nursery that developed rootstock that we were able to easily access that, so we're lucky to have access to that here. So I have a nice orchard in.
Oh, that's awesome.
I enjoy caring for it, but it's a lot of work. Yeah.
It is. I actually love apple trees, and that's amazing. I love ciders, and that's a conversation for a whole different day. But it looks like tomatoes actually is the big thing for us. People love tomatoes.
The
seems
season
like
is upon us.
People have tomatoes on their mind.
Yes, right.
Very, very true. Yeah, we had a bunch of really small tomatoes come up last year, and it was
mine
amazing.
didn't do so well this year. They had an early blight, and I have to do something about my garden soil, really, because now I've suffered this blight for a couple of years running, and so it definitely has taught me that I need to address some of the soil conditions. That there's issues. There's not enough hygiene in my garden. That I'm letting pests and pathogens overwinter in the soil, and so that's just another facet of really how the soil will influence. It's the environment. It's the home for the plants. They don't get to pick up and move. So I need to take care of that.
Yeah, and just kind of thinking about that, are there certain things we can do, say in the wintertime or in the late fall or something, where we can kind of prepare our garden soil for, like, if we know, hey, we want to plant tomatoes next year or watermelon or something? Are there things we can do maybe in the off season to get the soil ready?
Absolutely. So it comes down to knowing what the issues are. So in the case that we were just discussing around my tomatoes and the blight, I had to recognize that issue to have an appropriate reaction, where we won't just go out and apply a panacea of some treatment or some spray, or the garden centers would love you to do that, but no, it comes down to that assessment process, and knowing what the conditions are that you're trying to address, and reacting appropriately.
And we talked a little bit about this kind of before we got started, but I'd be interested to know, and Nina, I know you touched on this a little bit, probably 5-10 minutes ago, but Zac, when we're thinking about the development of a specific landscape, what are some things that you think about initially, so even before you kind of get on site?
Okay, so that's a broad question, but I'm thinking, so a specific landscape could mean a specific landscape design, like maybe we have some plants in mind, or it could mean a specific place, or maybe it means both. But it comes back to that answer we keep returning to, is that there's an information gathering stage, and that helps us formulate our response to the site. So critical to that is the design process that starts with just kind of considering a design, considering a site, and ends with execution, is just iterating through, learning more about the site, crafting the design, refining it, until you have something that's ready to be executed or constructed. So that process begins often with us looking at the environmental factors like soil, the climate, local, broad scale. So Nina touched on this, the drainage of the soil, the topography, how it lays on the land. And we take all those factors into consideration when composing the design. So, yeah, they're critical. So.
Awesome. And audience, thank you all for your responses and everything like that. And I just want to check in with our audience really quick. So Andrew had a great follow-up question similar to your response, Andrew. So Andrew asks, what's the best resource to identify issues with your plants, and how can you address them effectively?
Okay, there's lots of great resources. For one, I would that springs to mind is your local extension agent. So make sure that you document your question. So often people will just pick a leaf off and put it. I think a photo of just that leaf. You really want to do a more holistic looking at the plant. So a good documentation of what the issues are, and then take that to your extension office, and they'll help guide you if they don't have the answer themselves. They'll guide you to the right personnel, like maybe something would get sent on to you, Nina.
But also, there's the Cornell Plant Clinic, Diagnostic Clinic, which people can send. I get people in Iowa who I have a problem.
Oh, wow.
I say, well, I would direct them to their local extension agent, but if they can't, there's the plant clinic, which can send samples and soil and plants. And
yeah, I wanted to bring up soil again in the response, is that it may be the problem really does lie in the soil, and so there are and when in my answer to what can you do to your garden over the winter is, it would never hurt to get some samples of your garden soil and send them into a testing laboratory. In particular, we like the Cornell testing lab. They have the soil health assessment.
Yeah, right. So that's incredibly important. Yeah. People used to say, "I'll take a soil sample," and what they meant was testing the nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus. But more than that, there's the physical aspect and the biological aspect of soil, which if you taken together, chemical, physical, biological, you get soil health. And so at Cornell Health Lab, Soil Health Lab does test all those
and we
parts.
can't overlook structure in soil, because you can have all the nutrients in the world, but if the structure's not there.
That's right. If you have a soil like a brick, doesn't matter if because the plant can't get into it. So you need to look at the physical aspects.
Yeah. So the answer to Andrew is a soil test would be great, and good documentation of the problem. Take it to your extension agent.
Awesome.
One in every state.
Awesome, Andrew. Thank you for checking in with that. And Nina, have you ran into that before? People just pull the leaf off their tree and just
very often I get a picture of a tree that's 50 feet away and it's a green blob, and I said, okay. That's back up there. I need a leaf. I need the whole tree. I need a leaf arrangement on the stem, and so if they come back, I can generally ID it for them.
Okay, it sounds like people are a little creative when they're like, okay, help me diagnose what's wrong. What's wrong with my soil?
And starting with identifying the species is the first part too of identifying the problem, because there are issues that are really correlated with different
and there are some
species.
Common diseases that we can
that helps us.
And Zac, I know you do a lot of work with landscape architecture and everything. What are some roadblocks that you've run into in the past as far as understanding the soil that you're working with?
Oh, there's so many good examples. Every site's different. I've spent the last 5 to 7 years working in Buffalo, New York, on a series of projects on the waterfront in Buffalo, which is it's called the Buffalo Outer Harbor. It's all made land, so it's all just fill from the city where they've gone out and they've constructed, they've built up what was industrial landscape. So this is like legacy industrial landscape. You can imagine what's out there. Were railroad sightings. There aren't anymore, but there's a lot of toxic components to that, pollution and pollution that exceeds regulation. So we have to deal with that. But there's also just in that case, this is a large-scale landscape. We're talking hundreds of acres in development, and the soils are just, you never know what you're going to find. You know,
variability.
Every time we step, we're like, one of our mantras is we build up, not down, in the outer harbor, because we don't want to dig. We don't know what we're going to find. There's so much variability, so it's impossible to extrapolate from general testing, and we've done extensive testing. We have reams of documents, including the types of testing, the horticultural testing that we were just discussing for plant health. But it's just impossible to extrapolate from one area, in that case, to another. So
it's really important to know the history of the site, like Buffalo, big industrial, and there are all kinds of leftover landscapes that have been impacted by industry in one way. I was working on a former coal mine, which was now a big site for plants, and all the plants were dying, and guess what? They didn't realize that they were dealing with a coal mine. So
when you said that, then it immediately sprung to, like, I knew exactly where that was going, that you have a really low pH, extremely low pH.
And poor water holding capacity, and also poor drainage, because it was all compacted.
It was, it was heavy equipment.
It was like the trifecta of bad things. So we had to understand that before we understood. People said, why are the trees dying? And so, okay, let's look at the soil. That's what you do. Let's look at the soil.
And do you often get a history of, what might have happened in the past, similar to the coal mine example?
We would try as much as possible.
To the answer of, how do you approach a new site? How do you approach a design? What are the first things you think of? And it's data gathering, it's research, it's reconstructing that history. For any site, we'll dive back into the natural history of the site. It's even its cultural history. And really try to understand it enough that we can make a proposal about
what was on that site
what were
before.
people doing there, what was appropriate, what worked, what didn't work. So that it's that first stage of our design process is really the data gathering and research, and there's even social components of engaging the communities around these spaces and making sure that what we're doing is the right fit.
Interesting. And have you found that certain soil compositions are easier to work with versus others?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Sometimes we get lucky. No, there are. We have when we're designing a soil, we do have kind of a target space that we shoot for in the texture triangle, in the USDA texture triangle, and kind of a Goldilocks, silt loam, the kind of neutral pH soil. As far as plant health, what do they call it? Well drained, consistently moist and well drained.
Moist, well drained. Yeah, it's like not too hot, not too cold, just right.
Yeah. The Goldilocks of soils.
Right.
That puts us in a space in terms of that soil environment where we have a better surety of plant health. Right. It's like easier. That's the easy. But we're not always looking for easy. A lot of times we're looking to create successes out of hard cases.
And can people change their soil composition?
To a degree.
To a degree. I mean, you can't, unless you remove it and replace it, which is totally ecologically unsustainable. Unless a little space, you want to do a window box, you can do that. But in a large scale, you can amend with organic matter, which we agree with a lot in terms of compost. And that really does feed the microorganisms in the soil and helps to
build structure
and make the nutrients available. So adding that organic matter is a big part of what we can do.
That's one of the ways we can deal with compaction. A pH is really one of the first things we look at, and unfortunately we don't recommend that. We try to adjust pH. It's just not, in an agricultural setting, it's something that you can crop and it works, but a lot of what's
Landscape.
happening in landscape and horticulture can't be extrapolated from that.
Yeah,
And-
so we know which plants can do well at certain pHs, and so we say choose those plants. Don't choose a blueberry in a high pH soil because you're never going to do
design
well.
to your site because
Right.
And we actually just got a great audience question from Diana, who has a great follow-up question to this, but I want to make sure I got to get to this one first. So, Nina, you had mentioned earlier, different parts of the country have different soils and everything like that. So when it comes to certain parts of the country, are there general rules that people should keep in mind when they're thinking about picking a certain plant?
That's a really broad question.
Well, yeah, and I kind of have a loose answer to that. There are large scale climate patterns, and like Nina mentioned, different bedrock, from granite to
Rainfall. I mean,
Yeah.
you can have certain soils in the Southwest, but you have no rain.
and temperature.
And temperatures.
Temperature patterns.
So you can't just say it's the soil alone, although that's critical. You need to have the rainfall and the temperatures. That
And those are all
appropriate.
influenced by that soil environment,
right.
as you pointed out at the beginning. But we also need to acknowledge that every site, even from one locale to another, is different at a microclimatic level, and we really need to zoom in and do that assessment and look at the site and understand, is it shaded from, is it shaded from a building or a topography, or is there slope, or that's going to influence drainage. So it just as important as those large regional influences are the microclimatic, super localized influences, and that's why it's so important that we look carefully and do the assessment.
And I just got an interesting question in from Karen, kind of along this line. So Karen asks, I'm getting ready to plant vegetables in my raised planter. What should I do to amend the soil for fall veggies and lettuce?
Well, what's the soil there like for? Are they putting a raised bed? It means you're putting soil into a raised situation. So is it in natural soil there, or they're bringing in potted soil? There's lots of things to know about the soil first before you start to amend or not amend. If it has sufficient organic matter, you may not need to amend it with more organic matter. So it's really a question of understanding what the soil is before you start to add things to it. It could be perfectly good.
Okay.
Yeah, we keep coming back to that. Is that it's really about looking closely, understanding what's there. I mean, I would guess in a raised planter, this might not even be really truly soil. It could be a soilless media,
Could be, yeah.
and so it's those can be really droughty. So I guess just make sure that you're going to be able to provide adequate water,
Right.
Because that's really how that kind of planting environment works best.
And Karen, thank you so much for that question. So, and you had touched on the micro and macro things in soil, Nina. So my question for you is, what's in soil that helps promote plant growth?
Well, nutrients, obviously, the water, availability of water, and the drainage of water, the air, which is oxygen mostly that roots need, and the amount of soil, the volume of soil is critical because you have plants that need a certain volume to grow to their envisioned design size, and if you have a little postage stamp of soil, you're not going to get a big plant. They need to have certain, support to be able to get there. They also need microorganisms to actually help with structure of the soil, which is helping with drainage, which is helping with nutrition. So all these things are important.
And Zach, just as a quick follow-up, what landscape plants have you found that do really well given our soil location here at Cornell?
Yeah, I do have a kind of a core, stable of plants I know I can deploy when I'm not sure how they're going to be maintained. I'm not sure, what the follow-up will be. I have some favorite shrubby plants that have a lot of diversity of color and texture, like ninebark. It's available in a lot of different, from small to large, like in terms of its habit, how it will grow. It has multi-season interest, from colorful leaves when they emerge to nice fall color and ornamental bark. Similarly, some of the shrubby dogwoods, like the red twig dogwoods, those are really successful pretty much anywhere you want to put them. They have a wide tolerance range for the soil pH, soil compaction, moisture regime, if it's going to be totally wet or totally dry. Some plants like that. The list can go on. Some of the shrubby willows those are easy successes. St. John's wort, shrubby St. John's wort, another one. So these plants that you can reference either the Cornell Woody Plants database to look at kind of their tolerance ranges. If they have a wide pH tolerance and a wide soil hydraulic or hydrology tolerance from like permanently wet to permanently dry, those are typically low maintenance plants.
Plants with a wide tolerance are some of the best ones to choose because you're not sure if you're going to have a really wet year or it's going to go into drought. And some of those, and we have that information for 400 plants on the Woody Plant database.
That's the core information.
Yeah.
And then once you get past that, you can look at like disease issues. Is it a disease-resistant variety, or
and
is
it in your area, sometimes you have problems with a particular pest in an area that you wouldn't have another. So you need your local knowledge as well.
Again, we get down to you have to look closely.
And similar question, Nina. What plants have you found that you prefer to plant, in this area? I know, Zac, you had mentioned some shrubs a little bit, but Nina, what about you? Similar lines?
Well, I mean, okay, so you did shrubs, so
take the canopy.
I'll take the canopy. I mean, obviously I mentioned oaks earlier, but there are some oaks that are just incredibly tolerant of a wide range of, like chinkapin oak, like swamp white oak. There are just some that are very, very tough. There are also some of the newer elms that are disease resistant, are very, very easy to grow, tough, deal with a wide range of pH and water. What else? Gosh.
Well, I think it's important that once you know your environmental factors, like again, this area, we're talking about like a high pH soil because we know our bedrock is limestone bedrock. It's almost easier to just rule some stuff out.
Right.
Like you mentioned oaks, and it's like, well, there's some oaks that are
good,
acidity.
some oaks are not.
Yeah,
so you have to choose the species that do well.
And Diana, thank you for your question. I promised I would get to your question. So Diana just submitted a question. So her question was, can you suggest what soil is suitable for terrace plants and how to choose the best soil mix for urban gardens? So maybe when we're not in the out in the woods here.
So this is container gardening.
So that's where you need a lot of water holding capacity because you have a small volume, generally raised, and so you need to have a lot of organic to hold the water. If you had a very sandy mix, you'd have good drainage, but you wouldn't have enough water holding capacity. You need that Goldilocks again. Drainage, but water holding capacity. So a lot of these terrace mixes or box mixes should be amended with organic matter, compost.
And field soil is really not like just like the kind of soils that you find in a garden or in a landscape setting really aren't appropriate there.
They don't drain as well.
They don't, and you don't have the advantage of that. The microorganism communities that really need that space to thrive, and the interconnectivity that happens in larger landscape settings. When you're in a container, you need a lighter soil media. So that's
drainage would be
and then adequate water as a result.
And when we say buy a bag of soil or something, are there certain things that we can like quickly point out on a bag or something that kind of might help us understand the soil compound a little bit?
There's no truth in labeling for soil in a bag, but we if you're buying for a landscape setting, the way I specify soil is with a technical document, a 3-part spec, and we have the testing done for those kind of projects. At home, it would be a little bit harder, but you could go to, if you have a local supply, I can think of one there's here in our area that does have the testing to back up the soil that they're offering. So it's a little bit harder at the garden center because you don't know what's in the bag. But if you go to and look for the experts, and then they will have the technical information so that you can assess the pH. It'll be there. The soil texture, those two things.
The organic matter.
Yeah. You'll be able to get that information from basically a landscape supplier.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. And just as a quick follow-up, so, say we have somebody at Lowe's or Home Depot or, their local garden center, and they're thinking about buying some landscaping plants. So, Zach, what are some physical properties that people should look for when they're thinking about, buying their plants after they already understand their soil?
Yeah, well, so from the big box stores, from those chain retailers, who have dominated a lot of the green industry in the past few decades, the way they move material around, they move the plants around because they are chain retailers. We often see plants that are out of zone in those places. So making sure that what you're looking at is hardy in your region. This gets back to the discussion about hydrangeas at the beginning. They shouldn't be selling you hydrangeas that aren't hardy. Here, but that happens. Yeah, and then look for plant health. I mean, I love to go and rescue plants from those when they're on their last leg. I feel like a real hero. But you really need to assess the plant's health. Give it. You don't want to bring home disease and pests into your landscape.
It should look really good. It should be thriving. It should be full. Many stems if it's a shrub.
You can check the roots.
Yeah,
you can pull it out of the container.
You can put your hands in, make sure it's not been droughted, and it obviously it has to be hardy to get through the next winter. So that's important. So that's an important thing.
And how can having the wrong soil maybe affect the flower's physical properties?
Well, depending on, first thing I can think of is pH. If you have a wrong pH for the acidity or alkalinity for your plant, you can have plants that don't do very well and then therefore don't flower. So the flowering tends to be linked to the health of the plant. So also you can change color with some hydrangeas with the different pH, but that's another.
That's a good point. Often pH, a telltale sign would be chlorosis.
Right.
Not always, but often you can read imbalance in pH as chlorosis in the leaf,
which is a yellow leaf with a green vein. So that's an indication that there's something wrong with what you've chosen for the pH of the soil.
And then there's some great examples of just like stunted growth that. The wrong type of soil you can see one plant thrive in one space and then really kind of just creep along in another, and that could be an indication that the soil's just not providing the right kind of growing environment.
Often you can see if there's an area that's compacted, the plants will grow much slower and stunted in there versus those that have good tilth and the roots can get into it.
One of the first things we do with our students is go and look at the interval of growth, and as a way of judging like what kind of stressors are in the environment around a plant. And you can, if it has a good increment of growth, you can deduce that it's growing healthy and thriving, that it's putting out good growth every year. Or if it doesn't, if it's just like creeping along and from one year to another, it's really not moving, then we can judge that there's some kind of stressors at play.
And BZ actually just checks in with a really great question along this line. So BZ asks, how do you do a soil assessment for something like a tree that will be putting roots down many feet?
Well, that's a good misconception, is that plant roots trees may get down to 18 inches to 3 feet, maybe, but their roots are very superficial, even in big trees. So they might get to, as the roots go out beyond the canopy, they might be in the top 6 to 8 inches.
You've looked at this closely.
Yeah.
We've actually...
So there's a misconception that the tree roots are the mirror image of the top of the tree and they go down 30 feet or whatever. I mean, right at where the trunk is, you might get maybe 3 feet, but then they taper out beyond the tree, and 6 to 12 inches is where they are.
Yeah, most of the feeding and nutrient uptake happens in that space.
Surface. And so what you do to the surface of the soil under a tree really impacts that tree. So, digging right into that soil right near a tree, you just kill those roots.
So so sampling then becomes a matter of looking at the surface, looking in those top 6 to 12 inches. So we can use a probe, pull soil out from that profile. We usually we'll move aside if there's turf or an organic, the top layer, we'll move that aside and get into the soil, and then probe down to 6, 9 inches.
Yeah, but that's an important thing to know in construction or wherever roots are superficial.
And does soil change depending on the depth? So like you said, how tree roots don't go super, super deep, but does the soil change depending on depth?
Absolutely, yeah.
As you go down deeper, typically the soil is more dense, less organic matter, so you have a better tilth typically on the top, but depends on how that's been changed with construction or whatever. So, soil just change as you go down deeper.
And Zac, have you ever ran into a situation where the soil in different parts of a site are different?
Yeah, absolutely. That brings us back to the my story about the Buffalo Outer Harbor and how you dig in one area and it's foundry sands, it's just pure sand, and then you dig in another area and it's concrete that's been thrown away, and the soil's deriving its chemical composition from that concrete that's sitting out there underpinning the site. So that's very common in urban sites where most of our development work is. As a landscape architect, often we're working in parks and cities and streetscapes, and so almost always we run into the case where soil and man-made soils basically.
It's modified.
Construction. They're not pristine soils in place.
Any human impacted landscape, you're going to have modified soils.
That's quite common. So that's why we are always probing around and testing and trying to understand as much as we can, because there's no way we can get the formula for planting right without that information to start with.
And Kelly checks in with a really great question. This is actually something that I didn't think about, but Kelly checks in, and Kelly asks, would the overwhelming number of ants indicate anything regarding the soil health?
Just that the ants have found something that they can really get into. Ants are not useful necessarily for where you're going to plant. They can do damage to the roots. And so that's something I would always avoid if possible.
Yeah. On the flip side, if there was like zero life in the soil, I'd also be worried. So in some ways, it could be a positive sign, but it's not necessarily something you might get.
No, you don't want to necessarily plant in an anthill.
And for a novice person out there who doesn't know much about plants, or maybe saw a couple that they like or something, what are 3 or 4 plants that you would recommend that people can pick up and kind of work with that maybe will flourish in a variety of different soils or are tolerant of a variety of different soils? Maybe Zac, we'll start with you, and then you can.
Right. Well, I'm going to go back to that short list with the Physocarpus, which was the 9-bark, willows, shrubby willows. There's a lot of variety there. The St. John's wort and the shrubby dogwoods, with like the red twig dogwood. Those I'd identified those previously as plants that I plant often here because of that wide range of adaptability. I think a great research project would be to go to the Woody Plants database and kind of search through and look at those, like what other plants do we have there that have that wide adaptability.
What's good about the database, you can put in your soil or your site conditions and then get a list of plants, shrubs, trees, whatever, that would meet those site conditions. Or you can just put a name in and get the information that way too. But in terms of plants that I like a cotinus, which is a smoke bush, which is needs full sun and can take droughty soil and take moist soil, and it's great color and has a smoky flower appendages on it, and so it's one of my favorites. I like deer villa, which is what's the common name of that?
One. Bush honeysuckle.
Bush honeysuckle. It's not a bush. It's not a honeysuckle, but it's.
it is pepper foliaceae.
Right. But it's that's a great one. I like the newer, less common one is Heptacodium mycoinoides, 7 suns flower. It's a small tree, and it's blooming now. And it blooms later into the fall and has its beautiful sepals even after flowers go. That makes it wonderful. It's very tough. Deals with a lot of soil conditions.
We were talking about spireas before we started here. Pretty easygoing plant,
lots and lots of spireas.
And, or what about some conifers, or I think the eastern red cedar, the short one, the juniper,
gray owl,
Virginiana, the gray owl.
Gray owl is a short eastern red cedar, juniper. Eastern red cedar, again, it's not a cedar, but it's not red. It's not red.
The wood is red.
But it's our native
It avoids some of the deer issues that some of the other evergreens can suffer from, but to an extent.
Well, some of the arborvitae can get
Yeah.
really hit by deer, so that's an issue. If the deer is an issue for this particular landscape, so you need to understand the problems there.
And how can maybe weather patterns affect our soil? So I'm thinking up here in the Northeast, if we have a hard freeze or something like that, how can different weather patterns in different parts of the country affect their soil?
Well, as Nina said, the soil really dictates the availability of water and air. Depending on the composition of your soil, if it's a heavier soil, meaning more clay content, then it's more apt to hold on to moisture longer for various reasons. And so if you're in a really wet environment, like it has been here this fall, this late summer, then we might find that our soils are just permanently waterlogged and wet. And so that's one way, depending on the interrelationship between the soil properties, the environment.
But in terms of cold, I mean, soils, the larger the soil volume, the slower the change in temperature affects if you have a window box, the soil temperature is going to be more like the air temperature. But if you have a large volume of soil, it's going to change very slowly as the air temperature changes.
And Kimberly checks in, and I think this is a great question for you, Zac. So Kimberly checks in and she asks, do you have any recommendations for preparing a small community garden plot that has developed high phosphate levels?
So phosphate level, I mean, that's not typically, it's often a limiting factor, and in New York, across the board, typically we have more than enough. So I would just say that, like, as you're developing a fertilizer plan,
don't put phosphorus.
You don't need to add any. You don't need to add any phosphorus. So again, it comes back to, like, obviously there's some testing that's been done already. Utilizing that testing to determine if any fertilizer is needed and
or that
where
you could
and
have
when.
toxic levels, but phosphorus is generally not one I see. The only thing about
too much of
phosphorus
it,
is that
it runs off.
if it runs off into a water body, you can get eutrophication, you get algae growing and so on, which is not what we want.
Right. So that's why. Yeah. So typically, that's why we wouldn't want to put more of it on,
especially near a water body.
And just very, very quickly, Karen checks in. So Karen asks, how can we access the Cornell plant database?
Yeah. I typically just go with a Google search.
You can
Cornell Woody Plant Database.
Yeah, you can do Google search that, but you can go to the Urban Horticulture Institute, and on that page, the front page, there's the Woody Plant Database.
Perfect. Thank you, Karen, for that question. And as a quick follow-up, Andrew asked, do you have any recommendations, or do you have a recommended home test for soil composition? Maybe something people can buy at the store, or is there anything
there are meters, there's
There
pH
are-
meters.
pH meters are pretty easy to get, or
Soil moisture meters.
yeah,
We
whether
do have a whole protocol for doing soil texture by feel.
right. And so
that you
taking
can
this
learn.
course, you could do all the simple tests that
That's
you
one
need.
of the
Right.
first things we do in the course
Right,
is look at how to do these assessments.
Soil texture, and moisture holding capacity of the soil.
And you guys mentioned the course. So what are some things that, people might learn from taking the course?
Wow. We start from soup to nuts. We start with understanding plant ID and looking at plants, and then we go into site assessment. How do you do a site assessment? Big picture, small picture. Lots of videos on how to do this and how to do that and what it means. And we go into
We do site analysis after assessment,
site
which
analysis,
is more contextual.
right? It's
Yeah.
cultural issues as well as physical issues. And then we'll talk about how to modify the soil if you need to. I mean, there's some things we can do, and we have research based on modifying the soil. And then we go into plant selection. So you've done this, you've gone all the way there. Now what do you do? So plant selection based on different criteria and design issues and desires. And then finally transplanting, getting the plant in the ground the right way. There's some things that can go wrong there if they're not done correctly. And then design, how do you put design together?
Yeah, and document it.
And
We talk
document it,
about like
yeah.
the process of imagining something and then kind of putting pen to paper and allowing that process to help kind of mature the idea, making sure you have a plan that's testable, and working through that whole being your own critic and reviewer. And even into like soil specifications. And,
Right.
so really it follows the whole process that when you ask, like when you approach a site and or when you approach a landscape, what are some of the first things you think about? And so really it follows that whole process from beginning to end until we have a design.
And you had mentioned kind of modifying the soil. So what if someone's like just absolutely really in love with a plant and they need to modify their soil? How difficult is that?
Well, you can modify it physically by adding organic matter and incorporating it in a certain way, but I wouldn't recommend changing the pH of the soil in a large area, because it's just not. It's not going to happen. You'll have a short burst, but then it will go back to what it wants to be in terms of pH. So I would say, learn to love other plants. If you really want a rhododendron or a blueberry, which needs acid soil, put them in a box somewhere where you can control that. But if you have alkaline soil, you'll need to choose plants that can tolerate that. And there are lots of them.
Consider what you like about that plant and then find its corollary that is suitable for your site. That's another thing we do in the class is we talk about like looking at the range of that starts out with plant ID, like what are the physical features of a plant, and once you can really put a name to those features, you can kind of find its matches.
Interesting. And Kelly checks in with a really great question. So Kelly submitted a question, and Kelly's question is, what is the best resource for companion planting? Is there fungus that we would want to introduce? So companion planting.
That's generally used in vegetable planting, companion planting, where it's thought that some vegetables next to others can sequester insects or pests. But that's not something we generally do with woody plant landscape.
No, but there are good matches in terms of like the way we build a composition in a woody landscape. But we don't typically call them as companion plants. It's more of the language used around vegetable gardening. Good matches might be two plants that can occupy the same space but kind of use a different niche. So we think about like overstory and understory and even ground cover.
That's not, I'm sure not what she meant in terms of companion planting, but that's what we talk about in terms of using the strata
planting plants that are compatible with each other.
Right.
Yeah.
And as fall is slowly starting to creep up on us, I think next week, right? What should people be thinking about now as far as getting their yard and their landscape ready as far as next summer goes? Are there certain things that people can do now to get their space ready for next season?
One of the things I would recommend, which goes against the grain for many people, is when you can get your leaves off the lawn, which is fine, but put the leaves in your landscape beds.
I was going to say the same as mulching.
Because that's going to add organic matter. And so, on the lawn, it just tends to smother the lawn if you have lawn. But putting the leaves in the landscape beds will slowly break down and increase your organic matter.
Now, should we kind of tear apart the leaves, or can we just leave them?
You can put them in just pack them in.
Perfect. And how about you, Zach?
Yeah. So that was the first thing that popped to mind was like the fall mulching of the landscape beds. Other things we can do is we can go out and we can do a fall pruning, kind of clean up the structure, look for damaged areas, diseased areas, cut those away, remove them.
That can be done in the fall up to bud break. So it's a question of just getting in the garden and correcting problems you see in terms of structure and weed trees that have come in or something that you need to get out.
Some people will cut this time of year a little bit. I'm getting more farther into the fall already, but like cut some of the ornamental plants down to the ground and bed them in. Some of that stuff that's either half hardy, that's going to die back, and then bed those in for the spring so that they can reemerge, like ornamental grasses, maybe those hydrangeas that aren't hardy, that are only hardy to the crown, roses, other stuff like that. So it's a time for pruning and cleaning.
Mulching, cleaning up.
I'll burn off parts of my garden this time of year. So
I've heard that burning can really kind of help.
There's a lot of complex relationships involved in burning, and it provides some different types of carbon to the soil. We get some biochar out of it that has a lot of properties, is a way to deal with the disease in terms of like burning off diseased parts of like in my orchard. I don't want to just throw those like those diseased twigs around the ground underneath the same tree where it will reinfect next year. Yeah, so some of those activities. It's a time for cleaning up.
And while we're talking about the seasons and preparing and all that good stuff, Jennifer checks in. So Jennifer's question is, what are your thoughts about adding mulch to prepare for winter? Is the red or brown dye in those mulch bags a bad idea?
Well, they're not.
It's innocuous.
It's a personal preference thing. The dyes will actually eventually go away, and so why just not start with brown mulch or ordinary mulch?
They don't age well.
Those dyed mulches don't age well. So I would always go with the natural brown mulch. In terms of putting mulch on in the fall, you want to wait till the soil is pretty cold before you do that, because otherwise you can keep it abnormally warm with adding mulch, and that might have some winter damage to the plants.
Okay, and we just got a couple minutes left, so just my final question is, if you kind of reach out there to our audience and give them, one piece of advice as they get ready to, go to the garden store, get ready to prepare for next season's planting, or, thinking about, reworking their landscape a little bit, what's that one thing you would want them to walk away with, Zac, and then we'll go to you, Nina.
Okay, yeah. Well, I think learning from your mistakes and not repeating them. We were chatting before about like what we didn't get to plant this year, and I was thinking, well, like I had a lot of edits that I didn't get to. I didn't get to transplant some plants that I meant to be elsewhere because they weren't working in one place. Yeah, just be willing to like observe the pattern. It's a being a gardener, or landscaper, or landscape architect or designer. Is a game of patience, and and you learn from your mistakes, and so just pay close attention and see what's working, what's not, and then take action based on what you learn.
Sometimes less is more. I mean, sometimes things can get so crowded that you say, "Oh, I'm going to take this out, and things are going to look better." But that takes time and patience and looking to see. Your garden is never done. I mean, it's always a process of time and growth and what things are doing really well and outgrowing other things. And so what can you do to remedy that? So there's lots of things to do in this time of year, too.
I'll remember that. A garden's never done. I'll remember that when I'm
done.
thinking about, planning for next season. Well, Nina, Zac, thank you both so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. Audience, thank you for your participation. We really appreciate it. Have a good rest of your afternoon and have a good weekend, and we'll see you soon.